Thanks so much, Sehaam, and thanks to everybody for being here bright and early on a Thursday morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think about the future. Obviously, this is an absolutely fundamental component of a leader's work. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? And this particular aspect of leadership has, I think, become very much more difficult in the last 2 decades. And many people ascribe this to the pace of change. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think there's something, if you like, more profound going on than that. And that is that our ability to do accurate forecasting has shrunk. And when you think of management, management is essentially based on kind of what I think of as the 3-legged stool of management, which is forecast, plan, execute. So why is the first part of that become so difficult? Well, the combination of pervasive communications technologies and globalization has turned very much of what we do from work that was complicated to work that is now complex. And complex is not just complicated on steroids. They're fundamentally different ways of working and different ways of being. So systems that are complicated are linear. They do repeat themselves. They're very well managed by efficiency, and we have a lot of control over them. They're very much like, if you like, an assembly line. Complex is a different beast altogether. Complex systems are nonlinear. There are patterns within them, but they don't repeat themselves predictably. These are systems where very small things can have a gigantic impact. A virus, for example, a very small thing can have a gigantic impact. And there are also systems in which expertise definitely matters, but may not keep up because things change so quickly and unpredictably. So one way of thinking about this is, you know, in the old days when we used to go flying, you would go to the airport and check your bags and people would load the plane with food. Those were complicated procedures. They often involved multiple different companies, lots of different tasks and activities, but they were complicated. They were basically the same every day, all day, regardless really of airline or airport. And they were very predictable. And they were very well managed by efficiency. But once you get up in the air, your ability to know exactly what's going to happen, your ability to know exactly at the place where you are what the weather events are going to be, your ability to be confident that there won't be a bug in the software that runs the engines or there won't be a fault in the engines, that slips away. And as a consequence, flying is a complex activity. So it actually is not managed for efficiency, it's managed for robustness, which means the plane has more engines than it needs, that's expensive, and it has more different operating systems than it needs, that's expensive, because that way, if there's a fault in one, the whole system doesn't break. So it's managed in a completely different way because the context is different. And my experience of working with many companies, large and small around the world, is that this difference between complicated and complex is ill understood, if it's understood at all. Overwhelmingly, systems, companies, organizations are managed for efficiency. And that's where they go wrong. Because if you start to manage, for example, an airplane for efficiency, you have one engine, you have one operating system, and if there's a fault in one, the plane goes down. I would argue that the NHS, for example, in the UK has, well, really forever been managed for efficiency, which is why as the epidemic started, there weren't enough critical care beds because they were being used at capacity, super efficient, very bad for surprises. And there was insufficient PPE because you don't want a lot of stuff sitting around if you know you're not going to use it. And the problem is people thought they knew what the usage rate would be. So this difference between complicated and complex becomes quite important in terms of knowing where you are, what kind of system you're inhabiting, and how you deal with it, because you deal with the two in very different ways. So then the issue is that you can take the complicated systems and manage them for efficiency, and we pretty much know how to do that. But when you're in complex systems, and most systems that involve human judgment are complex, then you're in a different place altogether. And instead of thinking about forecast, plan, execute, you have to acknowledge, actually, the forecasting bit's always going to be a little bit dodgy. So what can you do? I think the first thing you have to do is acknowledge where you are and realize that efficient planning is not going to be your friend here. You can't see the whole of a complex system at once, but what you can do, and what I increasingly encourage leaders to do, is to map the ecosystem that they inhabit. Who are all the players that impact your business? And this is going to be, of course, your workforce. It's going to be your suppliers. It may be your suppliers' suppliers. It may be road and transport systems. It may be government policy. It may be weather. It may be all kinds of things. But actually, until you can map that entire ecosystem, you don't really know where you are. And then you have to start looking at that ecosystem and thinking, which of these relationships do I have a capacity to influence? So for example, if I'm very robust in my attitude with suppliers, so I may communicate with them more than I absolutely need to, I will try quite hard to understand their business, their ecosystem, because one of the ways I can make my company more resilient is by ensuring that all of the people, places, and things on which it relies are sources of trusted, secure relationships. Now, this isn't going to deliver guarantees, but it's going to make my business more resilient, more robust. In times of crisis, the suppliers that I work with and know well are more likely to help me out than those that I view in a purely transactional way. Also, in this kind of environment, you need to start thinking about experiments, right? I'm not quite sure, efficiency isn't my friend here, I'm not quite sure how to deal with a world that's unpredictable. So two examples of experiments. The one is relatively well known, which is to do with the Dutch healthcare system. The Dutch healthcare system looks after a lot of people at home. So it is a very, very well developed home nursing system. But it used to be run as ours is here in the UK, which is it was productized, it was managed with great efficiency. So every quality of service for every patient had a barcode, and it had costs and budgets and schedules attached to it. So 2 minutes on Wednesday, 3 minutes on Friday, 5 minutes on Monday. Nurses hated it, and it was very expensive to run. So one of the nurses who was involved in this system proposed an experiment. He said, actually, there are two pieces to this system. The first is complicated. It's the contractual arrangements between health insurance companies and patients and hospital systems. But it's bureaucracy. We can automate most of that, and we can make it require fewer people, and we can do it more quickly, and it can be very, very streamlined. But the really unpredictable part of this system is the patient, because actually even patients with exactly the same conditions will recover at different rates. So that's inherently unpredictable. So let's leave that to the nurse's judgment. So on the one hand, you have a rules-bound system handling all the paperwork. And on the other hand, you're saying to the nurses, use your best judgment. You're trained, you're qualified, you're motivated, you have vested interest in the well-being of your patient, because that's why you work here. So use your own judgment. So they did a pilot of this. It's an experiment. And what was fascinating about the experiment is they found out that actually when you start doing home care nursing this way, the costs fall by 30%. And the reason they fall by 30% is that the patients get better in half the time. Now, this is not the kind of thing you could ever figure out sitting at a desk. You would never have a model that showed you that this was possible. The only way you can know this is to do the experiment. And when I asked the nurse concerned, Jos de Blok, what had surprised him about his experiment, because he just hoped it would feel better, he just laughed and said, well, I just had no idea it would be so easy to make such a huge improvement. So in complex systems, you have to do experiments to understand what might now be possible. What insights might I have that I can't get any other way? Another great example, I did some work with the chief data officer at the Bank of England, and he could see, as many people in many organizations can see these days, that the workload was going to increase and there was going to be no commensurate increase in resources, no more people, no more time. So he thought about it and he thought, well, you can't just sweat people more. He could have done what most leaders do, which is take their leadership team off to a swanky hotel to come up with some grand plan, but he didn't feel very confident they were going to come up with anything particularly brilliant. So instead, his experiment was to invite experiments. He told the entire department what was going on. And he said, I want any and all proposals for what might make us more productive. And he got lots and lots of proposals. Not everybody wanted to proffer some, but he was surprised both by the number of proposals he got and their variety. So for example, one person proposed opening up the senior leadership team weekly meeting so that people could sit in and know what was going on. Someone else proposed radically redesigning the appraisal system. So the ones that were pretty straightforward and easy to do, he did. It turned out that opening the senior leadership team meeting to everybody made no difference at all. Lots of people came along at first. They realized there was nothing sensational going on. They stopped coming. It was actually pretty boring. But it did have a kind of benefit, a side effect, that people were no longer suspicious about what goes on in there. The redesign of the appraisal system was tremendous. It became much more participatory. People trusted it more. The quality of their enthusiasm for their work and their bosses went up palpably. Another proposal had been made for a different way of tagging the data that the Bank of England has to deal with. And this produced an exponential improvement in productivity. It was, Oliver told me, the kind of proposal you could never see from the center. That the people who are at the center, their expertise is a little dated and they're too far from the coalface. But the younger engineers whose digital know-how is much fresher and who are much closer to the problem came up with a spectacular solution of a kind that the senior leadership team would never have envisaged, or even if they'd kind of had inklings of it, probably would never have dared to propose. Now, there are a whole bunch of interesting things in that story. The first is that asking for experiments releases a huge amount of pent-up demand and knowledge within the organization. And it isn't that everyone had proposals. Lots of people, this is not the way they want to work, and they didn't have to. So what it also identified were the people who actually wanted to think and contribute to strategy. And again, one of the things that Oliver said to me is, he said, we tend to think of strategy as something that's led by senior people. It's a kind of, top of the table activity. And he said, what really surprised him was how good strategic thinking was proliferated across the organization. It was not concentrated only at the top. There's no way he would have had that insight had he not tried his experiment. And this is much of the thinking that lies today behind the rise of open strategy, which is doing very much what Oliver and Jos de Blok did, which is saying, use your judgment, use your imagination, tell me what you see from your position within this very complex system. Now, of course, for it to be at its most powerful, requires that people understand the system that they inhabit, and that it can be talked about in a way that even those who are in one part can understand the other part. This comes back to the fundamental theme of this conference, which is conversations and the avoidance of jargon, the ability to connect with people who may know things that you don't, and therefore create a need for an inclusive language. And on that front, I was very intrigued when I was doing some work recently with a financial services company. And we were talking about culture and how things were improving. And I said, well, how do you know things are improving? They said, well, we've done a survey. And what does it show? It shows that employee engagement has gone from 59% to 61%. I didn't think 61% was terribly high. And what does that mean? And there's this kind of long silence. And I said, well, it's obviously getting better. I said, well, maybe it's getting better. It may just be that all the people who hated working here left between surveys. It may be you gave it on a sunny day, not a rainy day. I mean, there are all sorts of things that could explain this change, and it may be meaningful, but it might not. So then there was another silence, and someone asked, well, so how would we know what it means? And I left the next silence really for as long as I could, because I thought this must be obvious, but apparently it wasn't. And he said, well, actually what you have to do is you have to sit down and talk to people. You have to talk to them about what does it feel like to work here? When you get home from work, do you tell your kids what you've been doing at the office all day? Do you even get home in time to talk to your kids? Are they even interested? Or are they listening to you talk about your work? Have they completely lost interest? But you actually have to sit down and talk to people at all levels of the organization to find out actually what does it feel like to be here. So there's a theme through this, right? Which is that our inability to forecast means that there is a huge amount about our organizations that we can't see and don't understand. And one of the critical ways to get better insight from which some foresight might emerge is to have frank and open conversations with people about where we are, what the challenges in front of us are, and to solicit their ideas, insights, observations, and suggestions. This doesn't work in a hierarchy, and it typically doesn't work in very ornate bureaucracies because people at the bottom have so little awareness of what's going on at the top. I would say finally, that what this lack of an ability to predict really challenges leaders to do, and I think increasingly this is their biggest task, is to hold the tension between two things. An organization that is going to have some future at all needs a large future facing guiding principle. And I specifically don't use the word purpose because it's already been hijacked by corporate communications to a point of almost instant meaninglessness. So I talk about guiding principles because the guiding principle of an organization is what it does and why. So for example, at CERN, which is the Center for European Center for Nuclear Research, the guiding principle is new knowledge of particle physics for a peaceful purpose. That's what defines everything they choose to do. At Arup, the construction and engineering firm, it's building, which is what they do, building a sustainable future. So what that does, among other things, is it tells them what they're not going to build, which is infrastructure and buildings that are not sustainable. So these are organizing principles that tell a company or an organization what it does and what it doesn't do. It's long-term. It should last, it'll be viable, relevant, meaningful for at least 100 years. And it tells people why they're there. If that's rock solid, then you can focus on having a workforce and systems that are super agile and nimble, which allow you to be hugely adaptive and responsive when change occurs that you didn't see going. This looks like a paradox. It's extreme short-term and extreme long-term. And holding the tension between the two is the job of leaders. If you are only agile, you become incoherent. You just react to everything until you have no idea what you're there for or what you're doing. Choices become opaque and random. If you're only long-term, you may not achieve enough fast enough, and you risk becoming redundant because you're not responding to a changing context. Holding the tension between these two and keeping an ongoing, rich conversation between the leadership and everyone in the organization is, I think, the only way in which we can overcome our inability to forecast and make good, intelligent, explainable choices and decisions. So I'm going to stop there so we have plenty of time for conversation.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Margaret. Insightful and useful as ever. There's a quick question. Was the home care example, nursing example, there was a question about where they might find that in your work.
Sure. So I've written it up in my book, Uncharted.
Mm-hmm.
It also appears in my TED Talk, which is called, I can't even remember what it's called, but something about leading in an unpredictable world.
Yes.
So yeah, you'll find it there.
Okay, thank you. And there's a tension between, you talk about tension between, long-term forecasting and being agile, and but there's a struggle, isn't there, as humans, even when we're trying to be agile, we put structure and process around that, to the extent that then it becomes another constraining aspect. Can you give an example of where you've seen a leader actually be responsive and fluid in their situation?
Yeah, so one of the issues in this tension between the very long term and the very short term is it changes how you have to think about planning. So a beautiful example is at CERN, for example, they do 5-year plans. And bear in mind, CERN is dealing with greater uncertainties than most organizations on Earth because they're doing experiments into things that might not exist, right? So this is pretty uncertain. But they, so they're thinking about, okay, if we want to do certain kinds of experiments, we need certain kinds of machinery. So we need certain kinds of people, we need certain kinds of expertise, so they can kind of roughly schedule and budget that, roughly. But as they do that, and when they put together the 5-year plan, it is not scheduled and budgeted, to the penny. So when some bright spark comes along, like Tim Berners-Lee, and says, I have this idea for this thing, this way of managing our information, that is nowhere in the budget or the schedule, but both are loose enough that because it's a good idea, you can say yes. Important to recognize that all the commercial partners CERN went out to declined to invest in it. So CERN funded it itself. Similarly, if you look at the Sanger Center in Cambridge, which is the sort of UK base for the Human Genome Project, they will do 5-year plans, but when suddenly in the middle of the 5 years, a good idea comes along, again, the budget is loose enough that if it's a good idea and it serves the ultimate kind of principle of the organization, then they have the capacity to respond and say yes. So essentially what these leaders are doing is they're very tight on the quality and the precision with which work is done, but they're very loose in planning for it. And I think this is especially crucial for companies, which are most companies, that depend fundamentally on innovation. Because our obsession with efficiency has meant that we do these 2, 3, 5-year plans. We design them with maximum efficiency, and a new idea comes up and there's no room for it. And everybody can see there's no room for it, so often the idea won't even come up. Because you cannot forecast or schedule excellent ideas, you need to be able to plan for the future with quite a lot of wiggle room. Now, nobody has been taught to do this. Everybody's been taught to do the perfect budget, which is kind of down to the last toe clipping. But what that does is it sends a message that actually there's no point having new ideas, because actually we can't afford them for the next 5 years. Everything's spoken for. And in a world where actually new ideas are sparked by changes in technology, changes in context at a ferocious speed, that's always going to leave companies behind. And so when companies come to me and say, what can we do to be more innovative? You know, my first question is, let's look at what you're doing to ensure that you're not innovative. And a lot of these sort of scheduling and budgeting processes do exactly that. They send out the word, sorry, no room for new ideas.
Thank you. We've got some questions coming in. I'm going to start with one from Clayton, who says, thank you, Margaret, for your inspiring clarity. Human-to-human interaction is clearly fundamental to dealing with complexity. Could you also please comment on how AI might or might not help us with the uncertainty of complex systems?
I think AI is pretty much a disaster in complex systems, actually, because AI is looking for patterns that are meaningful, and patterns in complex systems may or may not be meaningful. I think AI is absolutely bloody brilliant for complicated systems. It's brilliant at finding information which otherwise you could not find. But I think it's incredibly risky in systems, in complex systems. And that's partly because a lot of AI is looking for, its intelligence is based on historical models, which means that it's not itself adaptive enough to a changed context. And so you may find patterns that definitely were meaningful once, but may not be meaningful now. So human judgment is really fundamental here. And it's interesting, I've spent a lot of time when I was researching my book talking to people in the intelligence communities. And you know, they deal with uncertainty all the time because, for example, if you take terrorism, there is no profile of a terrorist. Terrorists understand that actually not being the same is exactly what gives them their strength. So AI doesn't help the intelligence services in trying to figure out, you know, these people behaving in this way, does it mean something or not? It could, it couldn't. So without human judgment, you're really in a very dangerous place.
Yeah, and I think that is a challenge. That is something we have to get better at as leaders, is finding that tension between, you know, where is efficiency and process really optimal, and then, you know, where's the elasticity and how we can be responsive. And you talked about efficiency. Hotels are always at maximum occupancy. That's what they're driving towards, and it really, I think, not only does it put the organization at risk of being able to respond to something unexpected, but it also, as you say, there's a mindset that goes with it that means people stop creating or stop, you know, they might see something that really would be great to do but don't. There's another question from Catalina. Ecosystem mapping can be overwhelming and paralyzing. Where do you start to be sure you can make a difference or innovate at a system level rather than at a product level?
Well, I mean, I think if it's overwhelming and paralyzing, I don't think ignorance is the alternative. I think you have to understand your place in the universe, as it were. But I think, then you have to keep asking the very practical question: how much of this can we influence? And the answer is, a lot of it you can't. There isn't a company in the world that could influence the development of COVID-19. All right, this is a natural process, and by the time you see it, it's there. So the important point is to understand, okay, most of this I can't influence, but these pieces I can. And so I want to check that those pieces I'm relating to in as rich and robust a way as possible. But I want to keep an eye on what's happening, even on the stuff that I can't influence, because it is going to influence me. And it may only be that it's going to make me think about robustness more often or in a very particular way, because all that stuff that you can't influence, but which influences you, contains uncertainty. So what is your defense against that? Bear in mind, uncertainty can't be quantified, whereas risk can. So it's a different beast. So I think really it's a way of staying humble. And I think this is true as far as in one's individual life, as in one's business life, right? Which there are many aspects of my life which I absolutely cannot influence or control, but I'm going to keep a wary eye on them in case there's change there, which I now need to respond to.
But so much of the technology these days is about gaining more and more control over the unpredictable, over the seemingly unpredictable, or the stuff that we're told is at risk. And so it's a challenge for leaders to what does it take? It takes practice to be able to balance those two things, to be comfortable with there's an element of uncertainty and I don't know and I can't control and I have to delegate that and my team will respond according. There's a lot of letting go of control that requires from leaders.
Well, that's why I think you end up inhabiting what I think of as this kind of tight, loose paradox, right? Which is you have to be loose in control because otherwise your organization becomes too brittle. We absolutely saw this within the National Health Service in the run-up to the pandemic, right? The illusion of control must have been very comforting. Wow, 100% capacity in ICU beds, that's super efficient. But it is an illusion. Because, it's not just that the pandemic overwhelmed it. All you need is a major road traffic accident to overwhelm it. So this, the control is a dangerous illusion. You've got to have some slack in a system that you can't predict, right? So the important thing is to be able to see in your organization which is the complex bit and which is the complicated bit, because they can't be managed in exactly the same way. And because since the Industrial Revolution, we've managed almost everything with a mind to efficiency, you've seen a lot of errors take place because there was no slack with which to adapt or to defend an organization against changes. For example, if you're in the plastic straw business this year or last year, suddenly the world changed. So there were elements of uncertainty. So if that was your only business, if that was your only product, you were in real difficulty. This is one reason why companies diversify. One company I worked with lost 50% of its sales overnight because of a bad review on Amazon. Now it looked super efficient to have all their sales online, right? No stores, no other way of selling. And so they sold everything through Amazon. So they entrusted the whole of their business to one sales point. That's really risky because actually you can't control every customer's response to your product or what they're going to say about it. So you have to think about, how do I spread some of this risk in order that one single point of contact not bring me down? I mean, there's uncertainty all over the place, right? Nobody thought Me Too was going to kind of burst out of nowhere when it did. We've had sexual assaults on women in the workplace forever. Why suddenly does it emerge? Why suddenly are all these companies in big trouble because of major lawsuits? So you have to recognize that this stuff is out there all the time. And so if you manage your company with enormous efficiency, you are not going to be resilient. And if you think that by forecasting you can prepare for this stuff, I think you're deluded about the complexity of social and economic life.
We have two more questions. One is from Andrew. How much of a time overhead do you think is appropriate for the consulting across hierarchy? 10% being 3 to 4 hours per week.
Well, I think it depends a lot on the nature of the business and the cadence of the business, the kind of cycles according to which it operates. And I think there are kind of two pieces of this. One, which we've all been talking about for a long time, which is hoping to have a culture of safety where when people see things that might be dangerous or a huge opportunity, they'll speak up. So that's a very formidable source of resilience if you can create a culture like that. I think there's been a lot of talk about psychological safety in companies, and my concern about that is there's a lot leaders can do on that front, but there's a lot they can't do. In an economic downturn, for example, no matter how much you try to make people feel safe, the economic context is going to make them feel unsafe and perhaps timid. But I think you have to, as a leader, try to create an environment in which people can say, I've had this great idea, or I think we've got a problem, Volkswagen emissions, and we need to do something about it now. Where those kinds of voluntary contributions are very easy to make and very easy to be heard. But then I think there's the more strategic stuff, and then I think it depends on where you are. Are you in a crisis, in which case do it fast? Are you doing strategic planning, in which case you may take a week, a year to do it? Do you have a very specific problem that you really must solve now? So the best example of this is at Pixar, where after many, many, many hugely successful movies, they found that the making of movies was getting much slower and much more expensive. And the classic response to that is, senior leadership team retreat, lots and lots of spreadsheets, cut, hand it back, shove it down the throats of the workforce and hope it works. At Pixar, they decided at the very last minute not to do that, but instead to close the company for a day and say, here's the problem. We think we need to cut the cost of movie making by 10%. We want all of your ideas about ways to do this. In the event, that process meant they cut costs by 20% because they had so many ideas, all of which turned out to be really productive, that actually they had more ways of impacting the business than the leadership team had even seen. And some of that was to do with culture, and some of it was to do with process, and some of it was to do with technology. So it depends on the nature of the problem. I don't think it necessarily has to be, wildly lugubrious. People get terribly, terribly frightened by the notion of, oh my God, I'm going to have to talk to the workforce and I'm going to have to ask them for ideas. That's going to take forever. World Cafe processes work really well. I think one of the key things is, if you're going to adopt a process like that, the crucial thing is when you have an idea that everybody thinks is a jolly good idea, you have to ask who's going to volunteer to lead the charge with it. Because if nobody will, don't bother. It's the easiest thing in the world to say it's a great idea, but oh, I don't want to touch it. If nobody wants to touch it, it's not that great an idea. So the element of volunteerism, I think, is also crucial.
Brilliant. And I think we can squeeze in one more question. I'm just going to check that I haven't missed anything, because some people have put lots of comments in the chat. So there's a question from Bettina. Why do you think the corporate world is misusing purpose? Why do they instrumentalize it?
Well, you know, we've had mission statements and we've had vision statements, and I think there's a huge desire to look good without necessarily doing good, because looking good seems to be easier and quicker and cheaper. I mean, I think the truth is that if a company is going serious about purpose, it has to be willing to change. And in many instances, you know, and I've looked at lots and lots of corporate purpose statements, I have found very few that mean anything. I mean, one of them, you know, and I won't name the company, but one of them is helping Britain flourish. I mean, it could be a florist, it could be a school, it could be insurance company. I mean, it could be anything. I have no idea what it does. You know, it could be a new cannabis manufacturer, for all I know. So it doesn't do anything, really. So this is just PR. This is, you know, the kind of toxic mix of PR and corporate comms. So it, you know, it has to have real muscle. And if it has real muscle, then it's going to have consequences. And I think what happened to purpose, you know, purpose really got welly, so to speak, when Paul Pullman took over Unilever. Well, when he took over Unilever, almost everything at Unilever changed. And everybody thought, oh, Pullman's great, he's such a hero. You know, we need a purpose statement. But what he was saying is, no, we don't need a purpose statement. We need a purpose. And the purpose has to change what we do always. So it's not ever finished. But nobody wanted to do, or most companies didn't want to do that hard work. So instead they did the purpose statement instead of thinking about and pursuing the purpose. It's just easier, quicker, cheaper, much more efficient.
Yes, and we do rally around certain words as the latest buzzword or
Yeah.
the latest concept that you know, other people are talking about and we need to do as well. So Margaret, this has been wonderful. Just some lovely messages in the chat, people saying they love the explanation of the difference between complicated and complex, and efficiency versus overall productivity. Love the Pixar example. What else? I've got to scan this very quickly. Love the point on psychological safety, and knowing what you can and what you can't do. Yeah, and some others which will pass on to you and share with you. But thank you so much for coming on this morning and being our keynote. It's brilliant.
My pleasure. I hope you all have a really productive and creative day.